Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about a very important part of 19th century history, which is the Land League. So the Land League took place, or the Land League was set up during the late 1870s, early 1880s to combat evictions like the one that we just saw happening on that photograph there. So we're going to be studying this, and unlike a lot of aspects of Irish history, this one I think is a much more positive story. There's a much more positive outcome anyway for the poorest people. So first of all, I want to talk about, you know, the situation for people in, let's say, the late 1870s, early 1880s in Ireland, particularly in the west of Ireland at the time. So I was showing you this photograph about, right, so this shows an eviction, right, that was happening in the west of Ireland in County Mayo in 1880. So you see, you know, an example of an eviction. Just to look at what else is going on, right? You can see right in blue, that's the population of continental Europe, right? And you can see that during the early 19th century, the population of Ireland was growing exponentially. And then the famine hit in the mid 1840s, 1845, lasted until 1852. And that started a huge decline in population. So 1 million people died during that time in Ireland out of a total population of 8 million. That's the agreed upon figure by the majority. That's the academic consensus in terms of the number of people who died. And then in terms of the people who emigrated, about 1 million during those years. And then emigration continued. So between 1850 and 1910 in the United States, you had 7 million people coming from Ireland to the United States, all right? So which is more than the population of Ireland today. So the emigration continued throughout the second half of the 19th century, until you can see the population was nearly under 4 million by the sort of 1920s or so. So the famine started off a change in the country's society like no other. So one thing that was a factor was that if you survived the famine, it meant that there was more land available for people. So for example, if your family had a farm of maybe, let's say, like 6 acres, and the neighbor's farm was 7 acres. So if the neighbor's farm, like if that was empty after the famine, you know, potentially you could buy it. You could start, rather than buying it, you could start renting it. Okay, so that would mean that you would have, you know, like a 13-acre farm instead, which would be more productive in the long term than these very, very small farms. So the people that survived, you know, they were able to consolidate their farms, often through things like marriage as well. You know, that was one of the most important aspects of marriage in the 19th century, particularly in the second half, you know, that you would get your son, let's say if you had a 10-acre farm, you would get your son to marry a daughter nearby who is about to inherit, you know, another 10-acre farm. And then you'd have a 20-acre farm together, which would be quite productive. So the population reduction, this sort of reduced the pressure on the land. And also it meant that agricultural wages had to go up because, look, there's the same amount of work to be done. The harvest, it was, you know, just as big, if not bigger, in the 1880s to in the 1840s, for example, but you have a lot fewer people to collect the harvest. So agricultural wages increased enormously. So definitely things were improving, but still like a good year for families in the late 1870s, particularly in the west of Ireland, was that they survived, right? That they were able to pay their rent and they were able to feed themselves. You know, they wouldn't have had much more than that. So that was, when I say that they were better off, they weren't starving. They weren't constantly in danger of starving to death in the 1870s. But they were still very much reliant on the potato, and they were still very vulnerable to a bad potato harvest. So nothing had fundamentally changed either. Just let me show you some other pictures that will illustrate the situation in a bit more detail here, right? So you see that, you know, the time of this famine in the early 1880s, late 1870s, right? So usually, you know, 1 year with 1879 to 1880, if the famine had only lasted, you know, for one winter, things would have been okay. They would have got back to normal fairly quickly, because people were able to withstand 1 year of a bad harvest. They could, for example, sell their furniture and sell their clothing, and you know, they could kind of make it through, get loans from local loan sharks, for example, but they weren't able to do that sort of long term. So what happened was they weren't able to pay their rent again. And especially, as you can see, look over in the west of the country, right, people start to get evicted, right? So they weren't able to pay their rent because they had to use their money to buy food. There was no other ways, otherwise they and their families were going to die. But you can see, look, over in Cork, Kerry, Galway, especially, right, in those counties, Limerick to a certain extent, Waterford and Tipperary, also in places like Donegal and Sligo, and County Leitrim. You know, there's still a lot of evictions happening in those places. So, you know, evictions were terrible. There is, you know, the fact that you're being thrown out onto the side of the road and your house is being burnt down. But there's also the shame, you know, of being evicted. And often people didn't have any choice when they were evicted. They basically, they had to go to the local workhouse, okay? Now, the workhouse was usually extremely cruel. The workhouses were designed to be a place where only the desperate would go. So the food was basically bread and water, you know, so the food wasn't very nutritious at all. So disease was rampant in the workhouses. They were also overcrowded, okay? So you would have workhouses that were designed for 5,000 people having, you know, 20,000 people in there. So think of, you know, the barracks in Auschwitz during the Holocaust, for example, where rooms are just, you know, absolutely packed with people. So it was like that. So it meant that diseases such as typhoid and cholera and scarlet fever and other diseases were rampant in these workhouses. Another thing was that they separated the families. So the mother was separated from her children. All children over 2.5 years were separated from the mother. And also the female children were separated from the male children. The husband was separated from their wife. So everybody was separated from one another. So you had girls in one part of the workhouse, boys in the other, women, older women in a third part, and then finally older men in a fourth part. And they never were able to see one another either. Now, I'm going to tell you the case of somebody called Michael David, right? So just bear with me and I'll show you a picture of Michael David here. Well, this is a picture of Michael David later in prison, right? We're going to hear about him a little bit later, okay? So when Michael David, right, was a young boy, right, he was only 5 years old. He was living in a place called Stride in County Mayo. And so this was the height of the famine, and his family couldn't afford to pay the rent. So his house was repossessed and the family were evicted, and the house was destroyed, you know, by the police, and all of this went on, and the furniture was thrown on the side of the street. So anyway, he and his mother and father and his little sister and his older brother, they, first of all, they went down to the local workhouse. Now, they had to walk there. The workhouse was in a place called Swineford, and it was 10 miles away. So they walked there with all their furniture. And, you know, they didn't know that they were going to be separated. So when they heard that they were going to be separated as a family, they said, look, no, we're not going to do this. And then they decided to walk all the way from Mayo all the way to Dublin in order to get an immigrant ship to take them to another country, because they thought there was no more hope in Ireland. So they walked all the way, you know, this is like hundreds of kilometers, right, from their hometown in Mayo, walked all the way to the port of Dublin. And there were people who would give them tickets so long as to sell them tickets or give them a loan of tickets so long as they paid them back. So this was kind of a business that was going on. So people would sell tickets. These ones were tickets from Dublin to Liverpool. So young Michael David, you know, he's 4 years of age with his parents. His parents managed to buy a ticket on a boat to take them over to Liverpool. And they had to pay back the person who sold them these tickets. They had to pay like basically 300% interest on the tickets, but they managed to get there. And they had met some people on the boat that had offered work to Michael David's father. Okay, so Michael David's father was able to get work in a place called Harlingford in England. Okay, now Harlingford is a place that is about 50 miles, right, or about 80 kilometers or so from Liverpool. So again, they had to walk that whole distance on foot, you know. There were trains and buses and stuff like that at that stage, you know, in the 1850. But they couldn't afford to take that. So anyway, they got a job in one of the factories, and there was lots of jobs over there at the time. Now, the working life for people in the north of England, in the industrial towns, wasn't much better than it was for the peasant farmers in Ireland. But so they had to work, you know, maybe like 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were children working as well, young boys and young girls, you know, children from age 3, as soon as they were able to walk, some of them were put to work. So Michael started working there in one of these factories when he was a very young child. And unfortunately, Michael, when he was 12 years of age, he was involved in an accident, right, in one of the factories. So you can see in the picture here, this is a picture of Michael David when he was a little bit older. He lost the arm through this accident, right? So he had this, his arm got stuck between two gears, right, in the factory, in the machinery. And his arm was sort of mangled and destroyed. And the only sort of solution was that the arm be amputated. So it was amputated, and this is something, you know, that happened a lot. See if I can see another photograph of it a little bit further back. Sorry, now I'll just go back to. Yeah, here's maybe a better picture here of Michael David, right? This is when he eventually became a member of Parliament. but you can see very clearly, you know, that he's only got one arm. So when he lost that arm, of course, the factory owners, you know, weren't interested. They provided no help for him whatsoever. But there was a local Methodist. So Methodism is a denomination of Christianity where people have a real focus on alleviating poverty. And this Methodist Christian took pity on the young Michael when he was a child after his accident in the factory. Because, you know, at this time, if somebody was disabled, you know, they couldn't work anymore, right? And Michael, the young Michael, didn't have any education at this stage, right, after his accident. So, you know, his future looked very much in doubt. So this Methodist Christian took pity on him, and he decided to pay for the young Michael's education. So the young Michael was able to get educated, and he was able to get a good job in a printing shop, and then a post office. So he did well in school, and, you know, in spite of his one-arm status, he was able to make some kind of life for himself. But, you know, the things that had affected him when he was a child, you know, the traumatic sort of eviction that had happened, and then, you know, that walk across Ireland, you know, in the one of the worst years of the famine, 1850, you know, the things that he must have seen as a child. Remember, he was only about 4.5 at that time, but, you know, the things that he must have seen during that walk, essentially from Mayo to Harlington in Lancashire, it must have been extremely traumatic, and it left, you know, an indelible mark in his memory, right, that he always remembered. So growing up with this, you know, he had great sort of sympathy for the plight of the Irish poor and for the plight of the poor working class as well in England. So, you know, he saw it as, you know, a common struggle. So, you know, the people who were in charge of things in England were the same people who were in charge of things in Ireland, right? The political and the economic elite, you know, the Conservative Party especially, right? So he saw that there was a common enemy in Britain and Ireland, but, you know, he was also a person who thought that the best way for Ireland to solve its problems is to get its own parliament, to get political independence from the rest of the United Kingdom. But he said that this was probably, you know, this is a long-term goal. That's not going to happen anytime sooner. But what he can do is try to help the situation for the rural poor in Ireland. So that's Michael David. Guys, do you have any questions so far? I want to just stop the presentation there for a second, just to see if you can hear me okay.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So my my presentation there, my screen presentation, I stopped there for a second. But yeah, so that's Michael David. So you know, like Michael David becomes a very, very important person later on in what is termed as the Land War. Okay, and the Land War made an absolute, you know, completely from night to day difference in the life of the vast majority of the rural poor, the peasants of Ireland. And we'll see how he did that. But first of all, we're going to explore the Land League in a little bit more detail. And then we're going to talk about how Michael David, right, when he was a young man, right, in the 1860s, so this is particularly in the year of the Fenian Uprising in 1867, the young Michael David, you know, he was only 23 years of age, and he decided to get involved with the Fenian Uprising. Because of his job as working in a post office, he was in a great position to, you know, start distributing guns, right? So for guns to be arriving and for him to send them to different parts of Ireland and other places in England as well to supply the people who were going to take part in this Fenian Rising. So the Fenians were basically this organization that was especially powerful in the United States and Canada, as well as Ireland. But a lot of the leaders were based in, the big cities in the United States. Because remember, these were people who had been children during the famine and who had been evicted maybe and thrown off their land. And then they had to, try to emigrate to another country, against their will. So they ended up, in the New Yorks and Chicagos and Boston and places like that. And then, they never forgot what happened in their childhood. And they remained very bitter against England. And they, as a result, they remained very politically active. So if they were anyway successful in the United States, if they were able to, make some money for themselves, they were more than willing to use this money to support a revolution or a struggle to get Irish independence back home. Okay, so that's what they were looking at. So that was the Fenian Rising of 1867. So anyway, there was one day where Michael David, right, he was waiting at a train station, waiting for a supply of pens to arrive. But the pens, right, quote unquote, were actually guns, right? They were officially known as pens, but the authorities were closing in on him. And he was arrested at Paddington Station in London when he was waiting on basically a shipment of guns to arrive at the station. And he was going to be sending it off to a different place in Ireland, right, using the post. So he was arrested and then he was thrown into prison for 15 years. So he was given 15 years hard labor. His time in prison was very cruel indeed. So you can see that picture that I sent you earlier. Let's see if I can get it up there again, right? Where, he was given solitary confinement in the prison. So he was put in a room on his own. And he was given the job of basically making rope. And he had to make a certain amount of rope, and it was a very tedious job, because he was pulling kind of old ropes apart and then using them to kind of create new ropes. And he had a certain amount that he had to do every day. And his quotas, so the amount of rope that he had to make every day, was the same as somebody who had use of both of their arms, but he had only one arm. And he spent nearly a year in solitary confinement, which, it would have been horrible. He only had kind of a wooden bed, to sleep on. The food was very poor in quality. It was extremely cold. He didn't have any blankets when he was sleeping. He had to go to the toilet, both number 1 and number 2 in the same room. There was no plumbing. There was no running water, so he couldn't wash himself. So, and he was stuck in there, in darkness as well, for a lot of the time, with just one skylight that shone in one part of the room where he could do his work. So he in his later writings, in his later autobiographies, he writes about this time, the first year when he was in solitary confinement, as being by far the most difficult part of his life. And he said that he kind of he had lost his mind. If you're away from human contact for extended periods of time, you start to, you start to lose control of your thoughts. I think because he was an Irish revolutionary and he was imprisoned in England, remember, in Dartmoor prison, the prison guards, treated him terribly, treated him much worse than any of the other prisoners. So anyway, that's where Michael David ended up. Now, there was a campaign that was led by the Fenians, right, in the United States, but as well as in Ireland, to have people like Michael David freed. Okay, so they wanted them to be seen as political prisoners. And, you know, the 15 years was a very harsh punishment for what he had done, right? Because he wasn't involved in any fighting himself, you know, and he wasn't one of the leaders of the rising either. He was, you know, like he was very young at the time. So there was a huge campaign that was started in both the US newspapers, US and Canadian newspapers. For example, the New York Times, by the Irish community over there, right, that had money to kind of support these campaigns, and among some of the London press as well, to have prisoners such as Michael David released. So this became very popular as well in Ireland. Now, you know, like even if people, the mainstream of opinion in Ireland, the mainstream of nationalist opinion wouldn't have necessarily been in favor of an armed struggle, but they would have been in favor of, for example, land reform, right, for poor farmers, and for alleviating the extreme poor from the effects of the famine, for example, and for, you know, freeing political prisoners, right? So it's something that both the nationalist community that supported, you know, peace and constitutional means, political means to achieve their aims of Irish independence, and also, let's say, the political section of society that favored an armed struggle. Both of those communities were able to come together on the one issue of freeing political prisoners. So after 7 years, Michael David was freed, and he immediately came back to Ireland. Now, he was put into prison, right, in the late 1860s, and he spent nearly 8 years in prison. When he was released, there was a famine that happened very shortly after the famine that I was talking about in the late 1870s, early 1880s in Ireland. So he went straight back to Ireland when he heard about that, and he found it like to be his, you know, this is what he was meant to do, right? Because, you know, he had been evicted himself as a child. He also spoke Irish. You know, the community that he had lived in, Harlingford, where his parents were working, was an Irish-speaking community, kind of an Irish-speaking ghetto. So when he went over to the west of Ireland, you know, he really sympathized with the agricultural, rural peasants who was in danger of losing their land to evictions again. And he started to think about how to organize them more effectively. Now, he had been allowed to write letters as well from prison and receive letters towards the end of his time in prison. And he managed as well towards the end of his time in prison to get access to books. So he started reading and studying and, you know, becoming familiar with the reasons of the agricultural difficulties for the Irish poor, to understand them, understand why they're happening and the economic factors behind it and everything. So, you know, he had educated himself when he was in prison. And he also, when he came out of prison, he went to Knight University as well to further his education. So, right, I'm going to just share my screen now again. Okay, so okay, so I'm going to pick up now, right, with this organization that Michael David started, right? So he went over to Mayo, over to Shroyd, in a small little town in rural Mayo, where he had grown up and where his house had been, you know, that he had been evicted from. He went over there and he started this group, the Land League, right? So as I was saying, just to review what we were looking at earlier, right? So there was an agricultural depression and famine from 1877 to 1879. There was very poor harvests. And then the reappearance of the famine from 1879, 1880, 1881. There was a slump in food prices as well, following the cheap import of American grain. So Ireland's market was open to agricultural products from other countries. So that meant that the Irish farmer, when they were selling their produce, right, to pay their rent, they had to compete, against very, very cheap products from other countries. So it meant that they were earning less money to pay their rent and couldn't afford to pay their rent. Also, there were fewer jobs in England for migratory workers too, because there was an economic depression in England. Okay, so the factories weren't producing as much because demand was starting to go down. And also, the amount of, let's say, cotton that was being produced in the United States started to increase massively. So this started to make British factories kind of look at other products for them to make in their industries, okay, because they couldn't compete with the prices of American cotton, for example, because American cotton, well, up until the Civil War, it had been produced using slave labor, right? So they could sell it for very, very cheap prices indeed. And even after emancipation in the United States following the American Civil War, the wages for agricultural workers, for the people picking cotton from the cotton plant in cotton plantations in the US and southern US, was very, very low. So they were able to produce cotton for very cheap prices indeed in comparison to England. So there was a drastic fall in farmers' incomes as a result. And then they demanded a reduction, the farmers demanded a reduction or a remittance of rents. Now, of course, the landlords, right, who were living in London, they weren't willing to, to accept the reduction. A lot of them, for example, they had never been to the lands that they held in Ireland. A lot of them had spent all of their life living in England, and they had no idea of the difficulty of the rural poor in Ireland. Also, the rent in Irish farms, right, per acre was 3 times the equivalent for the same type of acre, so the same quality of land with the same fertility, the same productive value, etc., in England, right? So people were paying, like a massive amount to rent their farms, their small little farms in Ireland. In comparison to in England. So, it's very difficult for them to afford to pay these rents. So again, people started, getting evicted. You can see another image of an eviction here. And the evictions were lawful, because, the tenants weren't paying their rent. So according to the law of the land, they could be taken off their land forcibly. And, the exact same thing that Michael David had seen when he was a child and that he had been a victim of was happening once again in Ireland. And, there was it could have been an absolute disaster. Now, the famine was saved from a couple of different factors. First of all, there was a huge kind of religious missionary campaign, a lot of it coming from England, from Christian groups such as the Methodists and the Society of Friends in England coming over to Ireland with relief schemes, for example, building soup kitchens and things like that. And also, like, another thing that solved it was exports of agricultural products were stopped. So this is, maybe a lesson that they had learned from the 1840s famine, right, from the Great Famine. And that helped to reduce prices of agricultural goods so people could buy food to a certain extent. But it was around this time then that the land war started, right? That the Land League was set up. So what was needed was a popular agrarian. So agrarian is just like, it's from agriculture or food. Agricola is the Latin for farm, okay? So it comes from that word. So agrarian movement directed against landlords. And what they needed was organization on a national scale, right? So again, just to review what we were saying about Michael David, here's a picture of him when he was in his mid-40s. Okay, so his family was evicted when he had been a child. He was brought up in England, where he worked in one of the cotton mills in Arlingford. So he was imprisoned for Fenian activity in England in 1867. And excuse me, he believed in cooperation with constitutional nationalists. So as I was saying earlier, there was two kind of methods for achieving independence in Ireland, right? There had been the peaceful constitutional method, right, which had been followed by Daniel O'Connell and by his supporters, right? And also that was being followed now by the new leader of the Home Rule Party, a guy by the name of Charles Stewart Parnell, who we're going to hear a little bit more about in a minute. And then the other side of Irish nationalism was the side that supported an armed, violent struggle in order to get independence, if needs be. And this movement would be represented by the Fenians, right? The Fenians, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was a secret organization that whose sole aim was to plan an armed revolt against England to get Irish independence. And you know, we had seen as well this that side of Irish nationalism, of the movement for Irish national independence in 1798. You know, they'd organized an armed rising against the British, which was unsuccessful. But anyway, these were the two campaigns. But Michael David, one of the ways that he was a revolutionary was when he came out of prison, he thought, right, that what they need to do is work together, right? You know, united, we conquer, divided, we fall. That was his attitude. And if there were divisions between, you know, different perspectives on nationalism that you still have in Ireland today, right? You still have you know, a minority of people who support a violent armed struggle in Northern Ireland, for example, although it's much smaller than it's ever been. If those two groups were able to work together, you know, that would be the best. So he decided, like I was saying earlier, that, you know, maybe an armed struggle was unrealistic, or national independence for Ireland was unrealistic in the short term. But what they could do, they could try to use legal means, constitutional methods, to get an improvement in the situation for the rural poor, right? So for my ancestors. So like the research that I've done into some of my family's farms around this time, you know, in the 1870s, they would have been in that group of people who had, well, my one set of relatives who were from the north, they had an 11-acre farm, which was, you know, in the grand scale of things, very, very small. And, you know, they were one of the groups that would have benefited the most from the land war, but we'll see how that happens. And also for my mother's family coming from South Kilkenny, they were actually, they didn't have any land at all. One section of them, they were just agricultural workers, they were just laborers. So they were renting a cottage, but they had, you know, they had half an acre basically. They had a little potato garden out the back, but you know, they were reliant on wages from the bigger farmers, let's say. So both of those groups would have stood to gain enormously through the land war that's going to happen. Okay. So how did the land war actually happen, right? How were they organized? Well, David believed that an agrarian war should lead to both land reform and constitutional change. And he started a campaign of agitation in County Mayo. And I was saying that, right, he wanted to get the people who supported, the achievement of national independence through a constitutional method under Parnell and the Home Rule Party. And then, people like the Fenians and the IRB who supported an armed struggle against the English on the other side. So he was able to unite the two of these groups under Charles Stewart Parnell. Now, Charles Stewart Parnell is an interesting character in himself, right? So I'm going to just explain the life of Parnell in a little bit of detail now in a second, right? Just to tell you where he came from. Okay, so just bear with me and I will get the other presentation up. Guys, are you still hearing me okay?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, great. One second there now. Okay, so Charles Stewart Parnell. So you might have heard of this name before. For example, where the bus station is in Cork is called Parnell Place. You have Parnell Square at the top of O'Connell Street, the main street in the capital, up in Dublin, right? And there's a huge statue of him as well at the end of that street. And so who was Charles Stewart Parnell? Well, Parnell, right, is the most unlikely of heroes of the Irish tenant farmer, the small Irish tenant farmer, right? Because Charles Stewart Parnell was actually part of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, right? He was a member of the Church of Ireland. He owned a huge estate in County Wicklow called Avondale, which still exists today, and you can visit it, and there's a museum there. You can see the house where he grew up in. And he was also a landlord himself, so he had many, many tenants himself. But he was a kind landlord. He treated his tenants well. He was also somebody who, whatever happened in his early life, he became an extremely ardent, passionate patriot for Ireland. Now, one of the reasons maybe, right, is that his mother was American from the United States. And his mother's father was known as Charles Stewart, and he had been an admiral during the 1815 defeat of the British Navy by the US Navy, right? So Charles Stewart was this hero in the United States, when the United States at the time was a much smaller, weaker country than Britain, right? Britain, which had a huge empire. So he had that strain of let's say a US attitude to Irish independence, coming from his mother, and an interest in politics. But also his father had been involved in the 1798 revolution, right? Even though his father was a Presbyterian, or his grandfather was a Presbyterian up in Belfast, right? He had been part of, the Presbyterian element that was behind 1798 as well, and behind an organization called the United Irishmen, who organized the 1978 rebellion. So he had these two things as well behind him, even though he was, from the landlord class. Also, he was a notoriously kind of unruly child when he was growing up. He was always fighting, getting into fights with other kids, getting into fights, playing sports and things like that. In fact, he got into so many fights that when his parents divorced when he was 6 years old, they sent him off to a school over in England, and it was a girls' school only, a girls' boarding school, right? Because they were worried that he would start getting into more and more fights if they sent him to a boys' school. So anyway, like I was saying, he was born during the famine in 1846, the exact same year, as it happens, as Michael David, who became his great friend. He was the 7th of 11 children born to John Henry Parnell and Delia Tudor Stewart, right, who had been the daughter of Charles Stewart, the admiral. So the Parnells were Anglo-Irish, descended from a Protestant English family, originally from Congleton in Cheshire. Before moving to Ireland, the family seat at Avondale House in County Wicklow was inherited by Parnell's grandfather, William Parnell, okay, who lived from 1780 to 1821, who was an Irish Liberal MP for Wicklow from 1817 to 1820. And he had been the one as well who had been interested in the 1798 revolution when he was a young man. Parnell's grandfather on his mother's side, Charles Stewart, so he was born in 1778, lived until 1869, was awarded a gold medal by the United States Congress for gallantry in the war against the English in 1812. All right, so he was an admiral of the US Navy, as I was saying. So Parnell became High Sheriff of Wicklow in 1874, where his attention was drawn to the topic dominating Irish politics at the time, Isaac Butt's Home Rule League, right? So Isaac Butt was the leader of this Home Rule party before Charles Stewart Parnell came along, and their campaign for a moderate degree of self-government in Ireland. So here's a picture of Avondale House, his home in Wicklow in Ireland, right? After vandals removed a wonderful specimen of Cryptomeria. Okay. So Parnell became a member of Parliament. That was kind of typical, you know, if you weren't to join the army, people of his class, that was the only other choice. So he kind of fell into, you know, being a member of Parliament kind of by accident. So he was elected to the House of Commons in Westminster, London, for the Home Rule Party, right, as a Home Rule MP for County Meath in a by-election following the death of John Martin. He later served as a Member of Parliament, or MP, for Youghal in Cork, and later for Cork City from 1880 to 1891. Parnell spent his first year observing parliamentary proceedings in order to gain a better understanding of procedures. In order to gain a better understanding of procedures, because you will see later, right, that he uses the functions of Parliament itself, the rules of Parliament, in order to stop the business of Parliament from taking place, right? So he became more associated with a more radical wing of the Home Rule Party that was engaged in obstructionism, right? So basically what this was that MPs would give very, very long speeches about completely irrelevant topics in order to disrupt the functioning of the House of Commons, right? And they did this in order to get attention for Irish issues. Okay, so one of the rules of the House of Parliament, when a member of Parliament sits up and makes a speech, he can't be stopped from making that speech. Okay, so there's an element of free speech that you can't cut anybody else off if they have the floor, if they're talking, right? So he just basically kept on talking and talking and talking from, you know, whenever he started talking, 3 p.m. until, you know, 11 p.m. or something like that, right? And stopped any other business happening in the House. So anyway, the new departure, right, is this agreement that was made between Michael David, John Devoy, right, John Devoy was the main leader of the Fenians based in New York, and Parnell, right? So they made an agreement to work together. So this kind of allied effort to work together to improve things for farmers in Ireland. So that was what it was called, the New Departure, right? So they brought together Fenians and Parnell's radical home rulers, and they agreed verbally in 1979 to escalate the land war. So this was a national protest against landlords in Ireland, and this in turn led to the creation of the Irish Land League, which sought to help poor tenant farmers by reducing rents and assisting those facing eviction. Okay, so what did they do in order to achieve this, right? So the Irish National Land League, as I was saying earlier, was established by Michael David on the 21st of October 1879, with Parnell elected as the president. So Parnell was kind of the public face of the organization, but it was Michael David who actually ran it. Parnell was living over in Dublin, where he was a member of Parliament. Michael David was based in Ireland, where he was running the Land League on a day-to-day basis. So as part of the land war, they were pursuing what were known as the 3 Fs for small tenant farmers in Ireland. So the 3 Fs were, first of all, fair rent, right? So a rent that was chosen by an independent organization, right? Independent to the tenant and independent to the landlord, right? So a rent that was affordable for both parties. Fixity of tenure. So this is that, you know, you would get a tenancy, let's say, for a year, and you could extend that tenancy for as long as you wanted, right? So you couldn't be taken off your land so long as you were paying your rent. So if you're paying your rent, you had a guarantee of fixity of tenure. All right. So tenure is the noun of tenant. Okay. So even today in Ireland, right, if you normally you're given a tenancy agreement of a year or 2 years, but if you continue to pay your rent, you can stay in for longer, right? You can stay in for as long as you want. So you have a lot of power. And if the owner of the property that you're renting want to sell the house, they have to give you, I think it's 6 months notice. Okay. So, and then free sale. Now, even though people were renting their land, all right, they did improve their land and they did improve their property. So, for example, if they built a house out of stone rather than out of mud, or if they built a roof that was made of slate instead of a straw roof, right, or a thatched roof, these were improvements, and they could sell this interest, right? Before that, they weren't allowed to sell that at all. So they could sell their interest, let's say, the improvements that they made on their property. They could sell that to somebody else. So these were the 3 things that they were looking for. So the League organized resistance to evictions by landlords, by reductions in rent, and also they assisted the work of various relief agencies. So Parnell encouraged tenants and supporters to isolate and to socially exclude those who supported landlords and their agents. So the first person to receive the full force of this new method was an agent by the name of Captain Charles Boycott. Now, Captain Charles Boycott was Irish, right? So he was the agent. Now, what is the agent? The landlord was living in London, but they had an agent who was working locally that, you know, was collecting the rent, basically, and making sure that everything was carried out as it should be in the farm, you know. So what they did with this particularly cruel agent, Charles Boycott, who had been evicting tenants who hadn't been able to pay their rent, right? So what they did is basically everybody was organized to stop working for him. So all of the servants that worked at his house, all of the laborers that were collecting the harvest, right, that were working the farm, that were working the land. Remember, this is in the era before artificial fertilizers. So it was extremely labor intensive, to keep the land fertile, to put manure on it all the time. So along with people like the local blacksmith, right, who made iron products, the local postman stopped delivering his mail. The laundress stopped washing his clothing, washing his sheets. Local shopkeepers also refused to sell him food. Basically, everybody stopped having anything to do with Captain Boycott whatsoever, right? So this is where the term boycott comes from into English. Okay, so I might stop the presentation there for a little while and we'll have a bit of a break. Okay. So is there any questions you want to ask me so far? How's the sound, everybody? Is it okay?
Yeah.
It's not good. It's okay. It's okay.
It's okay.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. So guys, I'll see you in about 5 minutes or something like that. We'll have a cup of tea and return.
Okay.
Okay. So I was just explaining, right, about boycotting. So you might be familiar with this verb, right, from your knowledge of English. Okay, so boycott was the name of that agent, right, Captain Boycott. So as I was saying, right, he was an agent, so he wasn't a landlord himself, but he was acting on behalf of the landlord, who was living over in London and who was just getting the money from Ireland. But he was very, very cruel. Another economic factor that was going on at the time was that the international price of wool was increasing. So it became more profitable for landlords to have sheep on their land rather than, agricultural workers working with, wheat and barley and grain, for example. So that was another kind of economic factor feeding into the situation. So anyway, what they would do, would be like, it would have been very, very difficult for Captain Boycott, because remember, everybody in the village, everybody in the town, everybody was part of the Land League and everybody was following the instructions of the Land League, right? So nobody would do any business with him. His servants wouldn't work in his house. The laborers, people who were going to collect his harvest, they wouldn't operate either. The shopkeeper wouldn't serve him. The postman wouldn't deliver post to his house. The place where he had his linen and his clothing washed in the town, they wouldn't work with him anymore. So basically, like, nobody would have anything to do with him. Parnell called it, he said, you have to put this person into a moral Coventry. And also the landlord, sometimes let's say if somebody was evicted, another farmer would be sought, to take up the tenancy. But the Land League also acted against these people, right? So it wasn't just against the agents, it was anybody who went against the Land League. So if another person tried to take up the tenancy, he would get the same treatment. He would get boycotted as well. So it was from this event that boycott entered the English language. So it means, to stop doing business with somebody completely in order to put pressure on them to stop what they're doing. So for the harvest, right, of that year, no one in the southern part of Ireland right, would help him. No one would operate as his laborers in order to collect the harvest. So what they had to do in the end, they had to get members of the Orange Order from up in northeastern Ulster to come down and to use them to collect the harvest. So they did that, and the only way they were able to do that was with a police and army escort. And you see here that because of the Irish Land League agitation, this is from the London Illustrated News, Captain Boycott is on the road to Claremorris railway station. So he was actually, in the end, he was forced out of his job, and he was forced out of Ireland. He wasn't able to, nobody would serve him, even in Dublin, nobody would serve him. Because his photograph had been in the newspapers, so nobody wanted anything to do with him anywhere in Ireland. So he had to leave, basically. And this event, showed how effective the Land League could be if they got everybody in the village, everybody in the town, working together to ignore those who were going against the will of the Land League. And what was the will of the Land League, just to remind ourselves? Well, the will of the Land League was, again, the 3 Fs, right? So fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale, right? So these were the 3 Fs that everybody was talking about. Why did Parnell get involved? Well, Parnell wasn't a radical, right? He was sympathetic to the landlords, being a landlord himself. But he believed that in the long term, support for the agrarian movement would give more leverage, more power to the home rulers in Westminster. So, he thought that if the land question was solved, then, Ireland would be less likely to go through the method of having, a violent uprising in order to get independence in Ireland. So he believed that agitation would bring land reform, leading to better tenant-landlord relations, and landlords would then support home rule, and they would support Irish independence. And the conservative aim of, playing the landlords against the nationalists wouldn't work if he used those methods, right? So the conservative aim of winning landlords to the nationalist side was destroying them, would destroy them instead. So there were other tactics as well that were being used by the Land League. And the Land League, first of all, it was set up in Mayo, but when people saw how effective it was operating in Mayo, very quickly the Land League started operating in other places as well around the country. For example, in Cork and in Kerry. So we can see from, if you just have a look at this map, right, so this shows evictions, right, in 1881, okay, that we were looking at earlier. Okay, so you will see that, like, the number of Land League meetings very much follows the percentages of evictions, right? So, the places where evictions were at their most were also the places where Land League activity was at its greatest. And you can see here as well, these are right, maps of Ireland following, are illustrating different factors during the famine, right? That the percentage decline in holdings, is happening in the west of the country, particularly Kerry, Limerick, also Galway, Mayo. That evictions are happening particularly in the west as well. They're not affecting other parts of Ireland, like the northeast, for example, and the east around Dublin. Also, the percentage of town lands that are being auctioned off, right? So land that's up for sale. and also the percentage of deaths that are happening in the famines. So you can see that those self-same areas that were the worst affected by the famine are also the areas where there's most interest in the Land League, and there's most Land League activity going on. And then the methods of the Land League started to get more intense. So this is the No Rent Manifesto. Now, the leaders of the Land League, because they became so effective, you know, the British government started to become extremely worried about them. So all of the leaders of the Land League were arrested. It wasn't really clear what laws they had broken, because, you know, they were using legal methods, but they were arrested nonetheless, and they were put in Kilmainham jail in Dublin. But before they had been arrested, Michael David had set up the Women's Land League organization. So, for example, Charles Stewart Parnell's sister, Anna Parnell, she was the leader of the Women's Land League, and they were able to continue activities while the leaders such as Parnell and David and others, Brennan and Dillon, that you can see who signed this letter, while they were in prison. So the activities of the Land League continued on, in spite of the fact that they were in prison, continuing to put pressure on the landlords and on particularly the British government. So this is the text of the No Real Manifesto that was issued by the Land League leaders from their prison, Kilmainham, on the 18th of October, 1881. And it was published on the front page of the United Ireland newspaper on the 22nd of October. And it was also published in the New York Times. So people were very closely following what was happening in Ireland, in Irish America, New York, Boston, probably in Cordoba as well, I would imagine, Maria Teresa. I'm sure people were following this as well over there, you know, that had left during the famine. So anyway, this letter, I won't go through it. You can read it yourself. But basically, the plan here is that nobody pays rent. Nobody pays rent until the 3 Fs are adhered to, until legislation comes out of the Parliament in Westminster, which follow the 3 Fs. Remember, fair sale, fixity of tenure, and fair rent, right? So this was extremely effective as well as a tactic, as you can imagine, right? So this was the rent strike, okay? And the boycotting of both landlords and those who took over a farm, right? So if somebody, as I was saying earlier, if somebody inherited a tenancy, or if they took over a tenancy of somebody who had been evicted, they would get the same treatment. So in spite of the leaders' commitment to peaceful protests, there were many outrages, there were many murders. So there was violence, even though, you know, the Land League leaders were against it, violence did happen nonetheless. There was difficulty for Parnell disassociating himself from acts of violence, of which he disapproved, because, you know, he was the leader of the Land League. So it was difficult for them to deny responsibility. Now, one event happened which was notorious while or just after they were released from prison, was that the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, right, who was the person who was the Queen's representative, right? So Queen Victoria's representative in Ireland. So the Lord Lieutenant, the new one arrived in Dublin, and the Lord Lieutenant and their first in command were going for a walk in Phoenix Park in Dublin, and they were murdered in cold blood by people that were probably Fenians, people who supported, you know, an armed conflict to get rid of the British from Ireland. But they were associated in the press with the Land League and with Parnell, and this put enormous pressure on Parnell. Also, a letter appeared in the Times newspaper in London, which was purported to have been written by Parnell, which shows his prior knowledge of the murder being planned against the Lord Lieutenant in Dublin. Now, this letter turned out to be a forgery, and he was evicted, right? Parnell was evicted. You know, a lot of the damage had already been done. So yeah, his name was sort of being you know, destroyed in the media. So this is, you know, the method that the powers that be in London were using. But eventually, the three basic demands of the Land League: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. The three of them were eventually met under the premiership of Gladstone, of Prime Minister Gladstone, who was the leader of the Liberal Party. And then the Conservative Party decided to not only leave the new legislation in place when they came into power in the 1890s, but they decided to kill home rule or desire for independence through kindness, right? So killing home rule through kindness was their policy. So the Conservative Party continued with these reform policies, and by the end of the 1890s, almost all of the small tenant farmers in Ireland were in a position to buy their land, and most of them already had mortgages. So people like, for example, my great-grandfather's farm in Cavan, they were now owners of their own land. And then, you know, my ancestors in South Kilkenny, they were able to buy their own house, for example. So things got much, much better for the ordinary people in Ireland. And, you know, they started to be able to focus on things like education and, you know, getting better jobs in the cities and using those methods to improve things for their ancestors. So the land war was eventually effective in spite of these drawbacks. Things, though, for Parnell himself, just open up this other presentation there for a moment about Parnell to tell you what happened at the end of his life. Okay, so so this is something that we're talking about earlier. You know, the land war and the no rents scheme. So that organized resistance to evictions by landlords and reductions in rent. This all happened, okay, and you know, boycott, that all spoken about in this slide. So we've been through that already. Parnell, like David, did lots of tours in the United States to support to get Irish American support from there, and that was where a lot of the money was coming from to finance these campaigns. So Parnell toured America for 5 months in December 1879, raising funds for famine relief to secure support for home rule. The tour was a huge success. Parnell gained an audience even with the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, and addressed the United States House of Representatives even. And Michael David was on the tour with him as well, giving lectures all around the country. He spoke in 62 cities around the United States and Canada and earned £70,000 for the relief of distress in Ireland, which was an incredible amount at the time. However, his tour was cut short when a United Kingdom general election was called in 1880. So there was, so the Land Act came through. The first Land Act happened, and then the second Land Act happened in 1881. So these were under Gladstone, and these were introduced in an attempt to diffuse the situation, you know, because it was approaching a situation where there could have been civil war in Ireland. The Act established a land commission that reduced rents and that enabled some tenants to buy their farms. However, Parnell himself was arrested, as I was telling you earlier, on the 13th of October 1881 and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail for sabotaging the Land Act under the Coercion Act, and by signing the No Rent Manifesto, the one that I just showed you earlier, which called for a national tenant farmer strike, and that for everybody, this is everybody in the country, to stop paying their rent. Parnell's release from prison after 7 months was negotiated after a deal with the government on the rent arrears question. This allowed for 100,000 tenants to appeal for fair rents in the courts. Parnell also had to withdraw the manifesto and agreed to effectively end the Land League. This is a picture of Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, which you can visit today, and you can learn about, you can see the place where Parnell was imprisoned when he was there. So anyway, following his release from Kilmainham Jail, Parnell sought to build on his experience, and he gained huge support for the cause of Home Rule through constitutional means. He changed the name of the Home Rule party to the Irish Parliamentary Party, the IPP, in 1882. And in 1885, the Irish Parliamentary Party increased its number of seats in Westminster from 63 to 85. So this was when Parnell was at the height of his power. The IPP had evolved as a party, becoming much more Catholic, right? So a lot of the new members of the party were from a Catholic background. The period of 1886 to 1890 saw Parnell and the IPP holding the balance of power in the House of Parliament. So this is because neither the Conservative Party nor the Liberal Party, the two main political parties in Westminster, neither had an overall majority. So the Irish Parliamentary Party held the balance of power. So that's when they were at their most powerful. A similar thing happened to the Democratic Unionist Party in the last Parliament. Right, it's not the case anymore because the Conservatives under Johnson, Boris Johnson, have an outright majority. But that's the way it was under the last Parliament. So they needed the support of the Democratic Unionist Party in order to have a majority. And so that gave them an enormous power, and they were able to get Gladstone to do things for them that seemed impossible before. They also had a Home Rule bill for Ireland go through the Parliament, right? Now, it was defeated in Parliament, so some of the members of Gladstone's own party voted against Home Rule for Ireland. So it didn't come to pass. It didn't actually happen, but it still was an enormous, enormous progress had been made in the terms of Irish independence. So the land question still remained an issue for a lot of people in Parnell's party, because the reforms that had been made, the first land reform, the second land reform, they had affected kind of, the kind of medium-sized farmers and the bigger farmers. But so like my father's family would have benefited, but not my mother's family, let's say, in Kilkenny, who had only a little bit of land. So Parnell was at the height of his power when, in December 1889, he was named the co-respondent in the divorce of Captain William O'Shea. So Captain William O'Shea had been an MP in Parnell's party, and he had been the person who helped negotiate his release from prison as well, and his wife, Catherine. So the O'Sheas had been separated for many years, and Parnell and Catherine had been living together, and they had 3 children together. And Captain O'Shea had known about this. Now, Victorian society was much more conservative than it is today, than society is today. So this relationship between Parnell and the married woman was seen as absolutely scandalous, and it started to turn some powerful forces against them in Ireland. For example, the leadership of the Catholic Church. So this divorce case scandalized Catholic Ireland and split Parnell's Irish Parliamentary Party in two. Remember, I told you it had become more Catholic. Parnell did not contest the divorce as he wanted to marry Mrs. O'Shea, and the divorce was granted in 1890. They married on the 25th of June, 1891. Now, around this time, Parnell's health was deteriorating. It started to deteriorate rapidly in 1891 during the summer, following his marriage to Catherine. He had kidney disease, but he continued to campaign and address crowds. He died on the 6th of October, 1891 of pneumonia in the arms of his wife, Catherine O'Shea, and he was aged 45, so he's very, very young. His funeral took place on the 11th of October in Glasnevin Cemetery, was attended by over 200,000 people. He's still got a magnificent memorial in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. Parnell was an astute politician, possessed remarkable charisma, and had an engaging personality. He played a huge part in achieving more rights, along with Michael David. Michael David was equally heroic for tenant farmers and furthered the cause of Home Rule in Ireland. Parnell is widely regarded as one of the most extraordinary figures in Irish and British politics. He played an important part in the rise and fall of British governments and in converting Gladstone to Home Rule. So here's a quotation from Parnell. Do what is beyond your strengths, even should you fail sometimes. Okay, so that's Charles Stewart Parnell. So guys, Michael David as well, he died at a fairly early age, not quite as young as Parnell, but you know, he had really suffered in those years in prison, right? And you know, the lack of nutrition and you know, the cold and the disease. So you know, he started to get sick when he was in his 50s, and he died at the age of 60 in 1906. But he, you know, was able to look back in his life and be very proud of what he had done, how he had managed to improve things slowly but surely. Because, you know, had things not improved for the ordinary farmer, I think the events of, let's say, the early 20th century with 1916, with the Cultural Revolution, you know, the Gaelic Cultural Revolution, these things couldn't happen. The War of Independence, these things couldn't happen had it not been for the reforms that he had helped achieve. So people like Michael Collins, you know, his family and lots of other families had benefited enormously from those reforms. And, you know, like people from poor agricultural backgrounds like Michael Collins, you know, they wouldn't have been able to get an education had it not been for how much things were improved for him by the Land League. So it completely changed the game in Ireland. So anyway, that's the story of the Land League. And I think it's amazing to see what can be done when, you know, people work together. I think if you look at unions as well, you know, David was interested in, you know, helping workers in industrial England to organize as well. And I know that industrial unions can abuse their powers as well. But, you know, it was the first time really that, you know, these collectivized organizations were able to kind of improve the life of the really poor in Ireland. And Maria Teresa, your ancestor, the O'Sullivan, what year did they leave Ireland?
I think I didn't find any proof, any documents that prove that they arrived in a certain year. But I suppose they came in the 80s, perhaps 1880, perhaps,
Okay.
because I found the first document, I think it was 1882 or 81. That is for me a document that gives me a clue when they arrived in Argentina.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So you can see there that, you know, that was a time when the rural farmer was suffering particularly badly, you know, and, you know, again, it shows, look, that things aren't black and white. I did tell you that that famine, it could have been as disastrous as the Great Famine had been, had it not been for, you know, a lot of charitable organizations, particularly coming from England over to Ireland, to give people relief, you know, to set up soup kitchens and things like that. So, like, you know, it's not black and white, and, you know, I don't want to sort of have you believe that Ireland is, you know, is the victim and England is always the oppressor. You know, it's much more complex than that. And as David said in his own life, you know, the industrial poor in England were suffering greatly as well, and not just in England, but, you know, all over the world. David was particularly interested in, you know, the situation of the rural agrarian poor in Russia as well, you know. And like, had somebody like David come along in Russia in the 1880s, you know, like the Russian Revolution wouldn't have happened, because it kind of, you know, I think that's why a revolution of the same kind didn't happen in Ireland, because, you know, those reforms happened gradually and they happened in a more constitutional way, in a more peaceful way, than the way that perhaps they happened in other countries. So, you know, that's one thing that we can be grateful of. And the lives, the economic lives of people in the Free State, they didn't really improve that much, because things had already improved enormously, because people finally owned their own land. You know, that was a massive thing. And even today, you know, people are in Ireland, they are obsessed with land. You know, like, you might have heard of, there is a play by John B. Keane called The Field. I don't know if you've heard of this play, but it's, I'll send you a link to it in a moment. It won an Oscar actually for Best Actor, I think, for the male lead actor. I forget the name of the actor, but he plays the Bull McCabe as the character anyway, who basically, you know, inherits this field, right? And, you know, this field has been in his family for generations upon generations. And nobody else in the town, when the field is auctioned, right, in the 1890s, nobody else in the town, you know, would dare buy the field, because they know that, look, the Bull McCabe's family has been renting this field. But then an Irish American comes over and he sees this auction and he decides that he wants to buy the field for himself, not knowing the local culture. And tragedy ensues after that. But it kind of illustrates how, you know, how important land is to the Irish. And, you know, still people get murdered today in Ireland because of land. You know, people will, you know, it's not unheard of that people would, you know, murder their brother or their sister or their uncle or whatever, if they feel like that they haven't been given the land when they should have been given the land, you know. So it's sort of a tricky one. Even when, I'll tell you a funny story, that, remember, I was telling you about my mother's family in County Kilkenny, right? And there's still, yeah, it's the same as O'Shea. Yeah, it's just an anglicization, you know, of it. So that's kind of the phonetic translation of it into English.
Okay.
That happens in a lot of cases, you know, with a lot of different surnames. It gets phonetically translated into English. Yeah, so that's the English rendering of the Irish name. Just like O'Sullivan and O'Sullivan, you know, they're the same as well, you know. But anyway, you know, what was I talking about before that? I've forgotten. Oh yeah,
you were talking
people get
about your
murdered.
family in Kilkenny.
Oh yeah, my family. Yeah, so like I went, right, to see the house that my grandmother had grown up in County Kilkenny, and it's still occupied by relatives of mine, right? Basically, he would have been my mother's first cousin, let's say. But he doesn't have, well, I didn't know anything about this, but I found out from the experience of calling at the house, because I was kind of knocking at the door and taking photographs of the house, and then the neighbors came out, right? And they said, oh, you know, who are you? And I was explaining who I was, that I was Catherine Holden's grandson, right? And, you know, she had been born in this house and everything. And, you know, that my mother's first cousin had been living in this house. And she was saying, oh, you must mean Patrick Holden. So I said, yeah. And then she was telling me about him, but she was sort of saying, like, look, he's not there at the moment. And I was saying, look, can you tell him that I called? But she was like, I don't know if I can tell him you can call, because basically he might be suspicious that you're coming there in order to get the land.
I had the same feeling when I was in Bear Island.
Okay, imagine that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now that wasn't, look, I was just interested in seeing the house, you know. It didn't dawn on me at all you know, that I was going to get the house. But I mean, obviously, if I was given the house, I'd have no problem. But up until that moment, I hadn't thought about it. You know, I'd just been looking for the house. But you know, it kind of shows that, you know, we still have this issue. And you know, what may happen is that this guy, because he's a bachelor, he will probably, you know, who knows what will happen to the house after he dies, right? It probably will be just empty and fall into ruins. And that seems like a terrible tragedy to, you know, to my grandmother's memory. But it's beautiful. I can show you a picture of the house, because it's the most typically Irish house you can ever imagine. It's got a attached roof and everything, so it's a beautiful little house.
Yes, I wanted to ask you if the house has a Dutch roof. And
yeah,
it has.
yeah,
uh-huh.
And it has. And like, I don't have any other relatives that are alive from my mother's side. Now I know that there are cousins out there, but I don't know them. I don't know where they live. I don't have their contact details, you know. So you know, I was just wanting to kind of make a connection with somebody from that side, because, you know, I when I lost my mother, unfortunately, about 10 years ago. And, you know, when your mother dies, you kind of think, oh, I wish I'd asked her this, I wish I'd asked her that, I wish I'd, you know. So, you know, I wanted to kind of ask a few questions, really. That was what, you know, about what their life was like growing up. And, you know, so I don't know, I decided anyway not to give the neighbors my number, not to leave a message for them, but I said that I would call another day. So next time I'm down there, maybe I'll call and I'll try to say hello to this guy, Paddy Holden, see who he is. Yeah. But anyway, look, that's the story. But I'd love to kind of talk to him and maybe find out a little bit more about the history of the house there. You know, because, you know, his grandfather would have been, you know, obviously my great-great-grandfather as well. And, you know, he would have been alive during the Great Famine, you know. So it would be very interesting. I should do it. because if I wait too long, you know, it's going to be too late. You know. So there you go, guys. That's it for my talk tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed it, and next
Very
week
much.
is going to be our last week. I'm actually on holidays next week, so I've only got, I'm not going to be teaching you during the day, Akane. So there'll be another teacher teaching you during the day, but I am going to be doing the lecture.
Okay.
So yeah,
Enjoy
so
the
especially
holidays.
for Christmas.
Enjoy the holidays.
Have fun.
Okay, I will, and I'll see you next Thursday at the same time. Okay.
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 Thank you very much. It
Okay.
was very
Thanks, guys.
interesting. Bye.
See you.
Thank you. Bye bye. See you later. Bye bye.